Part 1. I first heard about moral relativism in one of my high school religion classes. My teacher at the time spent the entire first unit of the class focusing on this concept of moral relativism and how he believed it was diametrically opposed to the idea of having morals at all. As an ethics teacher, he placed a lot of value in this idea. In a classroom full of uninterested, lazy high school students, he wanted to grab their attention and force them to face these ethical questions head on. By explaining moral relativism away, he was aiming at a specific response common to students unfamiliar with philosophy and ethics. As long as someone isn't hurting anyone else, they can do whatever they want. When faced with difficult ethical scenarios, most students tended to lean on this kind of common sense catch-all where they only prioritize their own actions rather than face the complex ethical scenario before them. Built into most of these responses is what my teacher viewed as moral relativism. Part 2. Before we get into what he actually defined moral relativism as, I think it's important to define a few key terms. Most of the time, when people discuss philosophy or have an argument in general, they tend to make one of two types of claims: normative and descriptive. A descriptive claim would be a claim that makes a statement about how things currently are in the world, regardless of how they should be. It makes sense then that a normative claim is a claim in which you state how things should be, regardless of how they currently are. For example, let's consider the statement, incest is immoral. This would be an example of a normative claim because it claims that people have a moral obligation to do, or not do, something rather than describing what people do outside of morality. That being said, normative claims can be made about things other than morality, such as etiquette norms, self-interest norms, legal norms, and fashion norms. Let's consider a similar sentence, although this time I'll rephrase it. Most people consider incest to be immoral. This would now be an example of a descriptive claim because it tries to describe how the world currently is rather than how it should be. One important note is that both these statements could be false. A descriptive claim, as well as a normative claim, needs some kind of supporting argument or evidence to prove that it's true. With our previous example, maybe in actuality most people don't consider incest to be immoral. In that case, the claim would be false, but would still be a descriptive claim nonetheless. With those definitions out of the way, let's get back to moral relativism. I think that my teacher at the time would define moral relativism like this. Moral relativism is the belief that all morals or ethics should be subjective to the individual human. This is a normative claim, but more than that, this idea certainly fits the stereotypical response we discussed earlier. If someone wants to do something that I'm uncomfortable with, that's fine, since they have their own morality. With that, though, I think some clear issues already present themselves. What if someone wants to hurt themselves? Let's consider a scenario in which a close friend of yours recently broke up with their significant other, and have now decided to end their life. Ignoring the question of whether or not you have a moral obligation to help them, a moral relativist wouldn't be able to do so. They could reach out and try to help, but if a person truly believes that the only option is suicide, then you would be unable to make an objective claim for them. Almost as quickly as he defined the term, he had a quick response and argument against this belief. If morals are treated subjectively, then another person would not be able to make an objective claim about morality. If no one can make objective claims about morality, then you can't apply your own morality to someone else. The reason we discuss normative and descriptive claims is because, in truth, morality is descriptively relative between different people. People have different religious beliefs, cultural norms, or many other perspectives that affect their actions. Despite that, though, we need to be able to make normative arguments in order to discover the truth behind how we can and should interact with one another. This isn't to suggest that your morality should take the highest priority over other people's lives, but rather provide a justification for engaging them in debate about which person is right. This question certainly has implications into wider society, though, as many laws and taboos in society are determined by our ability to create an objective yet debatable legality for acts to follow. This becomes clear when you consider topics such as the legalization of certain drugs, lowering the drinking age, and legalizing certain sexual taboos such as public sex, incest, etc. Really though, my high school teacher wanted to prevent students from what's known as moral dumbfounding. This is when someone maintains a normative judgment without actually being able to articulate reasons for it. This then leads into a kind of moral sentimentalism, or the idea that morality is based on emotion. If we were to take a step back though, how might we make an argument for moral relativism? Could we make a slight shift in the definition to allow maybe a more reasonable amount of objectivity while still maintaining the same overall subjective theme? Part 3. Jesse J. Prinz outlines a kind of genealogy of morals in his book, The Emotional Construction of Morals. In the book, Prinz's main goal was to discover the descriptive reason behind what creates a moral. In order to better discover this idea, he first analyzed a set of historical cultures with moral norms that differed from our own, and then devised a set of conditions that determine whether or not a belief will be passed down to the next generation. So, the three conditions that he proposed for a single belief to be passed on were: 1. It at least historically yielded a material benefit to its believers or to people in a position to indoctrinate others. 2. It is situated in a narrative context that is easy to learn. And 3. It has a kind of emotional appeal. One example of this can be found in Plato's famous Symposium. In Plato's recount of the story, many Greek philosophers had assembled and began drinking while discussing what love is. Many different ideas are presented, but one thing that oftentimes makes modern readers uncomfortable is these philosophers' references to their pederastic relationships. Pederasty can be defined as sexual activity involving a man and a boy. Oftentimes in Greek culture, an elder, more accomplished man would take a younger boy under his wing and teach him a lot of social etiquette and moral etiquette, but unfortunately, this was oftentimes in exchange for sexual favors. This then led Prinz into subjectivism, which can essentially be a synonym for moral relativism. Just for clarity though, subjectivism, the truth of a moral claim, depends on individual beliefs. This, in a similar way to moral relativism, would suggest that some normative claim can be true and right for some people, while also being false and wrong for others. Prinz took this and sort of adapted this definition to fit his analysis of how morals are passed down, and created what's known as cultural relativism. Cultural relativism can be defined: the truth of a moral claim is dependent on the beliefs of the majority in a group or culture. Going back to the Greeks, their view of pederastic relationships was much different than the modern day view. They viewed it as a kind of ideal relationship in which both parties receive what they want. From the perspective of cultural relativism though, they simply had a subjectively different interpretation of morality that allowed for this kind of relationship, especially when compared to our modern culture. Prinz's argument for a culturally relative approach would seem to solve the inherent inability to make objective claims within a specific society between individuals. Additionally, his system would seem to solve the disparity between the descriptive and the normative realities of how humans approach morality. Despite this, we can now formalize three separate problems that Prinz's, although improved, relativism still faces. 1. The problem of moral disagreement. This is the problem we discussed earlier, in which individuals were unable to make demands of another individual under this relativistic view. Prinz's shift in relativism fixes this individualistic aspect, but again fails to be able to make objective claims between cultures and between different groups. Again, in our example of Greek pederasty, us in our modern culture would be unable to make claims about the morality of their pederastic relationships under Prinz's ideas. The next issue is number 2, the many groups problem. This problem simply identifies the fact that a single individual might belong to any number of culturally different groups. Someone might be a Christian who has certain beliefs, but they might also be culturally American. Some of their beliefs may be defined by their faith, while others are answered by general American pop culture. The third and final formal issue with Prinz's cultural relativism is the moral reformers objection. This issue identifies that oftentimes people who suggest moral reforms, such as the abolition of slavery in America, oftentimes begin as the minority until their belief spreads throughout a culture. So from the cultural relativism perspective, to suggest this kind of moral change would be normatively wrong to do. Part 4. Ultimately, moral relativism is generally considered a threat to morality itself. Morality is essentially a tool by which people can establish norms across groups. So when the subjectivity of morality, kind of in a descriptive sense, goes too high, it collides with the normative motivation behind any type of morality. My personal opinion would obviously be against moral relativism, as I feel the objectives against it are much too heavy to consider it a viable normative option. Despite that, in terms of descriptively, I would agree that its claims are true. But again, I don't think that changes my normative opinion. In the end though, moral relativism and the arguments against it are often cited as a prerequisite to establishing another, honestly more valuable moral system. So now that we know that one system doesn't work, we can begin to answer the massive question at the center of morality and ethics as a whole.